are in listen-only mode.
Hello and welcome to the webinar, the fourth webinar in the Global Good Practice Analysis series that we are offering. Thank you all for joining us. We have three presenters on the line that I'm really happy to have with us today that are ready to present to us about integrated and robust MRV for nationally determined contribution monitoring. The idea is that we want to look at how we can learn about what came before. So my name is Allison Toll. I work for UNDP. I'm part of the Low Emission Capacity Building Program based in New York. I'm going to go ahead and get my screen into full screen mode. Just one moment. Hopefully, there we go. I'm going to just give a quick overview of the agenda before I hand it over to our great speakers. As I mentioned, I'm going to do just a couple housekeeping things so that we make sure that everyone knows how to use the platform here on GoToWebinar. I'm then going to hand the screen over to our colleague Kelly Levin from the World Resources Institute, and she's going to kind of set the scene for us today so that we understand, since the Paris Agreement, what the transparency provisions are that are required. And then we're going to invite two guests from South Africa and from Ghana who are going to share with us their best practice examples and how they've worked with MRV and kind of shown us what can be done in terms of monitoring, measuring, and reporting. And then we'll go ahead and go into a question and answer session. With the guest that we have with us today, our guest Thapelo from South Africa will need to go to another presentation within an hour, so we'll have to excuse him during the presentation, but we hope that we'll have the opportunity to ask a couple of questions before that takes place. So just to give you a little bit of housekeeping, so to speak, I hope that everyone can hear me well right now. It looks like we have a number of attendees on the line. If you are having any technical difficulties or if you can't hear what I'm saying or what any of the presenters are saying, please feel free to go ahead and use the question or the chat box over in your control panel. I have a colleague on the line that is helping and he's able to read your questions and read your feedback, and if you can't hear what we're saying or if you're experiencing problems, he can go ahead and communicate that to us so that we can make sure that we're speaking more slowly or more loudly. He also may be able to help you troubleshoot a little bit if you're having problems. As I mentioned, we're going to go ahead and have a question and answer session. During the actual presentations, everybody is in mute mode, so we can't hear you. But as soon as we finish the presentations, we'll go ahead and open up the airwaves, so to speak, so that people can ask questions. And you can do this two different ways. You can do it by raising your hand, where you'll see over on the right-hand side of your screen there is a small icon that looks like a little hand, and you can go ahead and raise your hand. That signifies to me that you have a question, and I can go ahead and unmute you so that you can speak directly to the presenters. If you'd prefer not to use your own voice, you are welcome to just enter your question via the question box or the chat box. And then Sven, who's helping me in the background, is collating those questions, and we'll go ahead and read them out to everybody who's attending so that everyone can hear the question, and then the presenters can go ahead and respond. This entire session is being recorded, so if you miss anything or if you want to share it with any of your colleagues, we will, after the webinar, be sending around all of the presentations as well as the recording so that you can look at it at your own leisure and share it as needed. So before we start with our first presenter, I just want to give a tiny bit of background in terms of where this series comes from and how it started. The webinar series this is the fourth in the series, and we have another one coming next month, is part of a joint initiative between UNDP Low Emission Capacity Building Program and the International Partnership on Mitigation and MRV. The series aims to highlight various best practices that have been identified on topics such as low emission development strategies, nationally appropriate mitigation actions, measuring, reporting, and verification, and now nationally determined contributions and the implementation thereof. The two best practice examples that will be presented here today, both from Ghana and South Africa, are part of a larger portfolio of 40 case studies that were collected and assembled in order to increase ambition, enhance action, and provide relatable examples that peers can use to help design and implement various mitigation actions. At the end of the webinar, I'll be giving a little bit more information on that, but today, as you know, we're focusing specifically on integrated and robust MRV for NDC monitoring, and we'll be looking at exactly how we don't need to start from scratch, but rather we can build on what's come before in order to make sure that we have our measuring and reporting and verification systems in place. So to begin, I'd like to introduce our first speaker. The first speaker will be Kelly Levin from the World Resource Institute, and she'll be presenting to us on building upon current MRV systems to meet the transparency provisions of the Paris Agreement. Kelly is a senior associate with WRI's Major Emergent Economies objective. She leads WRI's Measurement and Performance Tracking Project, which builds capacity in developing countries to create and enhance systems that track emissions reductions associated with low-carbon development goals. She closely follows the negotiations under the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change and analyzes related emissions reduction targets and actions. Kelly has supported several governments, including South Africa, I believe, in the INDC design and transparency, and was a lead author of the WRI UNDP's INDC guidance document that was presented last year, and will also be leading the current NDC guidance document that is in the works. So I would like to now hand the screen over to Kelly so that she can frame the topics that we're talking about today before we move into the country presentations. Kelly, actually, that's right, I'm not going to hand the screen over to you. Rather, I'm just going to open your presentation and help go through as we move along. So the screen is yours and the floor is yours. Thanks, Kelly.
Terrific. Thanks so much, Allison. And thanks, Sven. Thanks to UNDP and the partnership for inviting me to present. So as Allison said, I'm going to go through the Paris provisions and the implication for MRV systems domestically, and also talk a little bit about how to build upon what we have rather than starting from scratch. If you could go to the next slide. So under the Paris Agreement, if you dig into Article 13, there are two paragraphs that lay out the purpose of the transparency framework within the Paris Agreement. And essentially, Article 13, paragraph 5 is talking about the transparency framework for action, and the purpose being to provide a clear understanding of climate action, to track progress towards NDCs, and inform the global stocktake and seeing how we're doing globally. And paragraph 6, talking about the purpose of the transparency framework for support, which is to provide clarity on support provided and received by parties, as well as give a full overview of the aggregate financial support provided to inform the global stocktake. The Paris Agreement transparency framework changes how transparency will be conducted for some countries, because it likely will increase the frequency and the quality of information on greenhouse gas emissions and climate support for some parties. Some parties are already reporting up to that level, but others may be reporting more frequently than they had been before. It also will provide clear guidance in some areas that have yet to be define the guidance, but over the next few years will be. So for example, there's a provision under the agreement to put together guidance around accounting for NDCs, which hadn't existed before. And it also includes technical expert reviews and multilateral consideration of progress, which could lead to significant improvements in reporting and measurement, as shown from the Kyoto Protocol. So alongside, importantly, there'll be a capacity building mechanism for transparency, which will help parties transition to be able to meet the provisions within the Paris Agreement. If you go to the next slide. There are a few core elements of monitoring under the Paris Agreement. So the first one is around national inventories of emissions, and many countries are already regularly providing information on this. The second is information necessary to track progress towards the NDC itself, and here I break apart mitigation and adaptation. And then in terms of support, developed country parties are to provide information on financial, technology transfer, and capacity building support provided to developing country parties, and developing country parties should provide information on financial technology transfer and capacity building support needed and received. So these are the core elements of monitoring, and I think it goes very nicely with these case studies, which just show how an integrated monitoring system can be developed that might capture information on all of these different pieces. If you go to the next slide. So just to dig into this a little bit more, in terms of monitoring emissions, this can be done at several levels. Related to the UNFCCC, the only one that is required is looking at emissions at the national level. And certainly this can be helpful for a number of different reasons. It gives a snapshot of national emissions, and if you look over time at inventories, you can see which sectors have grown the most in terms of emissions, and you can look at trends, which sectors contribute the most. But countries may also have or want to pursue monitoring of emissions at other levels for a variety of reasons. One could do it at the organizational level or the corporate level or the facility level, as well as the subnational level. And this can help facilitate policy making by looking at emissions data at different resolutions. It can help support policy objectives like emissions trading schemes, which require detailed source level data. It can help inform national inventories to be able to have spot checks for different sectoral emissions. It can help know where to target specific actions, and it provides a different level of granular information for stakeholders. And I know, as in South Africa, for example, there's reporting at a much finer resolution than just the national inventory, which I assume Capella will discuss as well. So all of these pieces can fit together to be able to support the transparency framework for the Paris Agreement, but again, only the national level is required under the Paris Agreement. If you go to the next slide. So under paragraph 7 of Article 13, this shows the relevant provision under the Paris Agreement for monitoring of emissions. So each party shall regularly provide information on a national inventory of sources and removal, emissions by sources, removals by sinks, using IPCC guidelines. If you go to the next slide. And there's a significant amount that can be built upon. So again, we're not starting from scratch. Certainly, many parties have recently put together national greenhouse gas inventories. Many have databases that collect relevant information that can be built upon and improved. To the extent that a country has been pursuing corporate or facility or subnational level reporting, a collection of those inventories can help strengthen the national inventory quality. There might be existing data sharing agreements among ministries, for example, or from the national to the local level, and certainly databases that collect sectoral or local level data that can feed into a national collection of greenhouse gas emissions. So again, as Allison said, not starting from scratch, but just seeing how we can improve upon existing systems that may exist in countries. If you go to the next slide. So if we take a look at the second aspect of reporting and monitoring for NDCs under the Paris Agreement, it is progress towards the NDC itself. And I'm going to just take mitigation and adaptation separately. But if you go to the next slide, you'll see the relevant article under the agreement. And this is essentially that parties provide regular information that's necessary to track progress. Presumably, whatever accounting guidance is adopted by the Conference of the Parties serving as the meeting of the parties to the Paris Agreement will dictate how progress is tracked. And all of the relevant reporting requirements in terms of what one reports to be able to track progress has yet to be determined. But again, this is a different aspect than a snapshot of national emissions, which just gives you a picture of total emissions in a previous year. And this looks at the how far you are towards meeting your commitment, whether or not it's an economy-wide target or a series of policies or a non-greenhouse gas target, what you've achieved so far, perhaps what is the greenhouse gas impact of that. And those reporting requirements have yet to be determined, but one wants confidence that you are on track towards meeting what you've submitted in your NDC under the Paris Agreement. If you go to the next slide. So the accounting guidance has yet to be developed, as well as the transparency guidance in terms of what will be reported. But in the meantime, there is significant methodological guidance that's been created that could be used or is perhaps already being used to be able to track progress towards different types of commitments, which could be helpful for NDCs. So for example, for targets, some may be aware that under the Greenhouse Gas Protocol, there's a mitigation goal standard, which could be used for any type of target, intensity or baseline scenario, or a peaking target, an absolute reduction from base year, what have you. For policies and projects, the Greenhouse Gas Protocol has a policy and action standard. For projects, obviously, there's significant experience with CDM, the Greenhouse Gas Protocol Project Standard, Gold Standard, VCS. Countries may be interested in also looking at sustainable development effects. Under the Initiative for Climate Action Transparency, or ICAT, which is a new initiative that's come out since the Paris Agreement, there'll be detailed guidance developed for sustainable development effects. But in the meantime, there's significant guidance that already exists. The NAMA Sustainable Development Evaluation Tool, the CDM Sustainable Development Co-Benefits Tool, and methods specific to various sustainable development methods and sustainable development effects. And then progress of implementation. There's no internationally accepted standard. We have developed a policy implementation framework, and I think here it's really looking at indicators that show progress towards implementation. And often for monitoring policies or projects or sustainable development effects, one can track or monitor key performance indicators in addition to quantifying effects. And tracking the key indicators is easier and low cost and often does a very good job of making sure that things are moving in the right direction. If you go to the next slide. So again, what can be built upon? There's significant experience already under BURs, which has a provision to report on the effects of NAMAs. Any domestic processes or databases that track the implementation or effects of actions, whether or not they're just domestic mitigation actions or NAMAs and targets. And I assume, again, that both of the presentations, given their integrated monitoring systems, will talk a bit about the extent to which the impacts of actions are tracked. And then any quantification methods that are already being used to quantify greenhouse gas and sustainable development impacts, as well as implementation. So again, significant amount that can be built upon, and then once the accounting guidance is developed by parties, that will be even further helpful to track implementation and progress towards the NDCs. If you go to the next slide, please. So the next aspect of tracking progress towards the NDC is adaptation. And if you go to the next slide. And again, under Article 13, there's a provision here under paragraph 8 that each party should, a recommendation rather than a requirement, provide information related to climate change impacts and adaptation per Article 7 as appropriate. If you go to the next slide. So a significant percentage of the INDCs include adaptation, and they what we've noticed is that they have been framed in 3 different ways, with 27 of them being around outcome goals, which articulate a particular adaptation outcome that a country aims to achieve. And these are usually quantitative, so you can think about Mexico's goal to achieve 0% deforestation by 2030. There are the majority having process-related goals. So noticing that adaptation requires an ongoing iterative process that could span decades, many countries created goals that set in motion particular elements of this long-term process. So, for example, in the Gambia, there's an intention to mainstream climate change adaptation into national development frameworks, such as the Program for Accelerated Growth and Employment. And then lastly, there are a number of countries with what we call vision statements, which articulate an overarching vision for adaptation, either in combination with these outcome or process goals or in lieu of them. So for example, in the Seychelles, there's a goal to minimize impacts of climate change through concerted and proactive action at all levels of society. If you go to the next slide, one of the most helpful things around these goals is to make them quote-unquote smart or specific, measurable, achievable, realistic, and time-bound, and break them down into discrete objectives and benchmarks to be able to monitor them. And this can also be very helpful for mitigation as well. Or one could link the goals to existing policies and programs that are already smart, and it might make it much easier to monitor. If you go to the next slide. Again, significant experience from countries to build upon. First is the NAPs, and then many countries are already using tools to monitor adaptation action. There's the Tracking Adaptation Measuring Development Framework that DFID and IIED have developed, and certainly a significant experience with smaller scale adaptation tracking. There's a GIZ tool for project money, the GCF, PPCR tracking of aggregation of portfolio of projects, and I think the question is how to build upon that for some of these broader vision statements and goal statements. If you go to the next slide. The last element is support, and here support refers to climate finance, technology transfer, and capacity building. It could be monetary support, such as climate finance towards developing a national emissions trading system, or funds towards organizing training workshops for energy auditors, or non-monetary, such as technical advice to design energy efficiency standards or a labeling scheme in a country. And here I've broken it apart for provision of support, receipt of support, and results and impact of support. If you go to the next slide. The way that this is broken up is, again, according to the Paris Agreement, and if you look at Article 13, paragraphs 9 and 10, it shows that developed countries are required to provide information on the support provided to developing countries, and developing countries should provide information on the support needed and received. There are also some articles in 9 and 11 that have some additional support-related reporting provisions. If you go to the next slide. Again, significant amount that can be built upon, the BURs, which countries are already identifying capacity needs, the national communications and BURs, where some parties report support needed for climate action as well as support received, the technology needs assessments, the UNFCCC needs project, which provides upon request information on the assessment of financing needs of non-Annex 1 parties to implement mitigation and adaptation measures, the DAC creditor reporting system, and others. If you go to the next slide. And then I've been focusing a lot on monitoring, but in terms of reporting, there's also a significant amount that can be built upon. Certainly the details for reporting will be clear in the future as the common modalities and procedures and guidelines for transparency of action and support get finalized under the Paris Agreement. But in the meantime, certainly countries can build upon any IT-based database systems that collect data on emissions or emission reductions or support or adaptation, any confidentiality arrangements that are already established in MOUs for sharing agreements for data, existing reporting procedures and systems for BURs and national inventories, which certainly can be built upon, and QA/QC procedures for data collection. If you go to the next slide. Just a quick note that a lot of countries can look at this in terms of a broader system to collect data, and there are synergies with other objectives for MRV of greenhouse gas emissions and climate action and support. And tracking progress towards an NDC could help track progress towards other goals, such as sustainable development goals. And there can be efficiencies in the system if the monitoring systems are designed in a way that can capture information relevant to multiple objectives at the same time. It could be an opportunity, if designed right, to build support for climate action, because one could see the sustainable development effects, for example, at the same time as the greenhouse gas effects. And I know that in South Africa they've been collecting data on non-greenhouse gas effects as well, which I'm sure Tapela will talk about. And certainly tracking of implementation for climate action can also enhance efficiency of implementation of policies at large. So just to mention that there are certainly benefits that can be realized through strengthening monitoring systems for climate action. If you go to the next slide. And just a concluding slide with some takeaways. First is that the Paris Agreement presents opportunities to improve transparency of action support, and importantly with greater opportunities for capacity building. The modalities and procedures and guidelines for transparency have yet to be created, but when they do, especially with the accounting guidance as well, they'll provide a lot more clarity on the detailed reporting and methods for tracking progress. But in the meantime, there's a lot that countries can build upon. First, the greenhouse gas inventory, which many countries have and have been strengthened over many years, is really the foundation for monitoring of mitigation targets. For adaptation goals, making them quote-unquote smart can be a helpful first step for monitoring. In many countries, existing systems can be built upon, as I've shown. There are many methods and tools, and in some countries, existing databases or data sharing agreements that can support monitoring of NDCs. And lastly, that monitoring of NDCs can be an opportunity to show progress towards multiple objectives. So with that, I will stop and hand this over to Tapela, because I know that he also has limited time. But thank you so much, and thanks again to UNDP and the partnership for inviting me.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Kelly. I think that that was really helpful in framing what is to come. So as we mentioned, Tapela will need to leave a little bit early, so we want to not hold this up at all. I would like to introduce, he is not speaker number 3, he is actually speaker number 2, Tapela Letiti, I'm probably mispronouncing that and I apologize in advance, is the Climate Change Director at the Department of Environmental Affairs in South Africa. In this capacity, Tapela is responsible for the design, development, and continuous improvement of monitoring and evaluation systems, so the MRV systems, for climate change response actions in South Africa. And this covers mitigation, adaptation, and climate finance. In addition to this role, Tapela also serves as a member of South Africa's International Assessment and Review Board and an International Consultation and Analysis as part of those expert teams, which provide review and oversight of the national greenhouse gas inventories, the biennial update reports, or BURs, and the national communications. Tapela holds a master's degree in chemical engineering and is currently completing his PhD, which is focused on effective domestic MRV systems as transparency tools for post-2020 climate action. So he is very well placed to be presenting to us today so that we can learn from the best practices that are currently underway in South Africa. So Tapela, I'm going to go ahead and hand the screen over to you. You should be receiving a little note saying that you can share your screen now. And then if you just want to go ahead. There we go. Yes, we can see it. The floor is yours.
Great.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Colleen. I was still drinking water, so I was not ready to talk as yet. I apologize. Can you hear me?
I can hear
Well,
you
you
loud
can't
and clear.
respond.
Yes, exactly.
Okay.
They're all on mute, but we hear you well. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, colleagues, for inviting me to be part of this discussion. Yes, while the agenda for the day says my presentation is on best case studies. Well, I wouldn't say best so much, but more of what we as South Africa have been doing and some of the lessons that we have learned. It is a 10-slide presentation as was requested. And it might even be shorter because Kelly actually mentioned a host of things that already are in our system. That is also the disadvantage of having the experts that work with you also being part of this. It's nothing bad, but it does mean, of course, it minimizes my work a little bit. So I'll start first with the slide that you're looking at, which basically shows two documents. One right on top is what we call the National Development Plan, and the one below is the National Climate Change Response White Paper or Policy Paper. Those are the two primary documents in South Africa that guide the work on climate change as a whole. And you can see I've taken quotes from each one. Right at the top, the National Development Plan says there's a need to build evidence base to inform planning, to prioritize data collection, and to monitor, report, and verify South Africa's progress towards the goals. So it talks about the need for an M&E system of some sort to do a host of things. I think that is very important to see that it's a host of things. And the quotation from the white paper itself says one of the key things one of the key reasons for the development of an M&E system, a nationwide or countrywide monitoring system, is so that we can formulate or inform the formulation of effective responses to climate change. And based on this primary mandate and other pieces of mandate, we have since then developed what you call an overall South Africa's M&E system. And what you see before you is actually what is defined in the white paper, the National Climate Change Response Policy, that we need at least those two systems, of course, that are part of the big monitoring system of South Africa, but they were explicitly defined as one. I'm starting from the bottom, an inventory system for, of course, for greenhouse gas inventories. It says for up-to-date and relevant climate information system. Relevant and up-to-date climate information in the form of a greenhouse gas inventory. And then moving to the top, the policy paper itself says then we need a system that then talks to many other elements: adaptation, monitoring and evaluation, climate information systems, risk impacts and vulnerability, mitigation, climate finance and other things. And that's what we usually call the response M&E system. And the two talk together. So the inventory system is really something you already know. So what I'll talk a little bit about, that will also incorporate the outcomes of the inventory system. I'll go further into the one at the top, which is the response M&E system. What is the overall objective? Well, it is defined in the policy as to track South Africa's transition towards a lower carbon and climate resilient society and economy. And among other things, it is to inform responses to climate change. It is to provide learning for experts like Kelly, who are busy, ever studying us and all of these things. To provide learning for policymakers, for researchers and others, but also to institutionalize reporting on South Africa's reporting obligations. now that point then starts to talk to INDC, BUR, National Communication. But it also says our negotiators at the UNFCCC platform should be informed, should understand what the implications of what is discussed or what we are presenting are. It is also designed as a one-stop shop for climate change information. Then it talks to lower carbon economy, which talks about South Africa's big picture mitigation efforts, which we call DEROS, and then company carbon budgets. And it specifically says we need to also understand implications of all of these things on jobs and wider sustainable development benefits. Climate resilience, among other things, the impact of climate change, but also it talks about tracking the responses themselves. Climate change finance, we need to track the use, the impact and the effectiveness of climate funds in climate change, and of course support the identification of resource requirements. Now what you have before me is a schematic of what we usually use, of how we view the climate change M&E response M&E system. It is designed to start from the front, which said, what do we want to know? What are we doing this response, implementing this response M&E system for? And the first one is what? To inform policy decision making, those points that I mentioned in the earlier slide. Then the primary outcome of the system for this is an annual report on climate change that responds to all of those points. The second part, as I said, responding to UNFCCC reporting obligations and any other information. For instance, local government in some cases might need to learn from each other what one municipality did and how they overcame barriers and so on. So we started from the front as we designed this, and we went backwards to then say, this is what we want, okay, that's the objective of the M&E system, and we go backwards and to say, how do we design this in terms of indicators, split between the three objectives of the system: climate resilience analysis, climate finance analysis, lower carbon analysis, and then to say, well, these are the equations, these are the indicators, then what information do they need? Then we move backwards towards the monitoring. I hope you can see this, yes. Then we move from here, we come to the what we call the MRV. Literally for us, it is the measurement that happens, reporting into our system, and quality control and quality assurance there. And all of this are underwritten by what we call monitoring and evaluation guidelines. This guidelines is a, this is where WRI helped us, as opposed to what you mentioned, Alison, that WRI or Kelly assisted us in INDC. In fact, the WRI has assisted us and is still busy assisting us with development of the monitoring and evaluation guidelines. This helps us to assess in terms equations, for instance, of on assessing the impact of different response measures at project level, at program level, but also at policy level. How do you integrate the impact of, relate the impact of the two different types of policies that might have overlaps? This is where the type of support and guidance that they are giving to us. And of course, for the system to work, other things that are in the framework for the M&E system, you have the question of long-term sustainability. What do we need for it to be sustainable? Well, it needs to have principles: timeliness, comprehensiveness, comparability, all of which are built into the system. We have to check the institutional arrangements, who report to who does the verification, who does the quality control, and all of these things. And information flow network framework then forced us to ask the question of where will the information come from? If we are talking climate information, who has the capability to give us that information or to generate that information? How does it get to us? How often, in what form, how is it packaged? Verification, who does verification for what, at which level, and indeed the relevant system review says we need to ensure that the system is continuously relevant to the common needs. For instance, when we came from Paris, the first thing we asked ourselves was, is our system relevant to the transparency needs of the Paris Agreement? And the answer to us in this particular case was yes. So that systematic review every now and then is key. Now taking you through each one of those three pillars or three parts of the MRV system. This is the climate resilience part, which usually would be called the adaptation part, but as you can see, we don't call it adaptation part for us because it is more than adaptation. Adaptation is only one component of it. So there we are asking questions about climate information. Is the temperature rising in South Africa? By how much? How quickly? What about the humidity? What about, all of this climate information? Are our systems or our observatories up to, to scratch to actually be able to tell us these things? In fact, some of our institutions are even monitoring concentrations of CO2 coming from certain areas and the changes and so on, the fluxes of CO2, and a little bit of projections around atmospheric data and so on. Then the second part of resilience talks to risks, impacts, and vulnerability. Here we are really saying, what are we observing? What do we see? And what is likely to happen? Well, more rainfall here, less rainfall there, droughts here, hurricanes there, what is this? So that we then start planning around where the interventions need to be and the type of interventions that need to be there. And the third pillar of resilience is really that of adaptation measures. And it is split into two in terms of climate institutional arrangements, who need to be leading what pieces of work, and where do, for instance, do we make use of existing institutions that are already doing this? The National Disaster Management Center, how do we equip it more to be able to respond to climate change impacts that might be inflated, and so on and so forth. Then the last part is really understanding the impact of adaptation projects and programs and so on. Now the second part of the MRV system, the response MRV system is now that of mitigation. We call it lower carbon tracking, and it is split into three levels. One, we call it high level. High level, we are really asking the question at the national level, how are we doing in terms of emissions, in terms of decoupling emissions from economic development, in terms of decoupling it from population growth, decoupling it from city growth, and all of these things. We are asking the questions of towards the NDC, how far are we doing towards our domestic targets, which is called the peak, plateau, and decline. How are we doing, and where are we going? So that's the national level question. Then number two level of disaggregation there goes to sectoral, subsectoral, and actually company level. There we are asking the question of, well, we see where the country is going at high level, but we want to understand who is pulling us forward and who is pulling us backwards in terms of the sectors, in terms of the companies, to understand who is contributing, what level, where should we be pushing, if we put policies, where should they be targeting, and so on and so forth. Now, number three, level three, which is called the response measure level, there we are really asking specific questions about individual projects. As much as possible at a program level, so we disaggregate as far as possible where programs are run with individual projects. For instance, we see CDM as an individual program, and therefore we quantify its impact as a collective on its own. And then we take the energy efficiency strategy as a single response measure. We assess its impact on its own and so on. The how train and so on and so forth. So there we actually link the whole high level with the individual response measures. Now the third part is that around climate finance. And here climate finance is defined to actually talk to financial support, but it also includes a little bit support for capacity building. So capacity building is built into this type of system, and we do it from a top-down and a bottom-up approach. So from a bottom-up perspective, we really ask for each one of the projects, how much capacity building was done, how much finance was done for each project. And then we compare this from a top down, from the source of the funding. The bottom up is from the end or where the finance goes to. The top is really, Jeff says they gave us this much, or we understand that this much money was received from Jeff, and we go from a bottom up to say how much of it went to this and that and that and that, and we consolidate and approach the assessment to understand the whole climate finance picture in South Africa. Now, as I said, the primary outcome of the M&E system is an annual report, and I think it is the best one to show you how then issues of the NDC, the tracking the NDC specifically, is then built into the system, and we can confidently say our system as it is adequately responds to the transparency needs of Paris. I've shown you the coverage of the annual report. The first part is around tracking transition to a climate resilient South Africa. You'll remember the very first part of our NDC talks to adaptation, and it talks about developing climate change adaptation strategies, developing desired outcomes, adaptation projects and programs. So we are monitoring that at point at A there under transition to climate resilient South Africa. I must say this is for us a lot of a learning curve from our perspective, because there was no other country from which to learn how to do an assessment of adaptation actions. And one of the approaches that we have since taken is that of elaborating what we call desired adaptation outcomes. These are sort of targets. What do we mean when we say we are more resilient? Well, it means we have more of this, less of that, inflation of that, and so on. So that helped us to then put together what we call the indicators, to then say, well, if we're really tracking this particular outcome, we should be tracking 1, 2, 3, 4. It's still a learning curve. We have since published the first annual report, still learning, and inputs we are still very much welcome into the approach. Of course, tracking transition to a lower carbon South Africa is a much simpler one that we have mostly done before, and I've highlighted the red there. Tracking the national picture of the transition is really South Africa's GHG, elaborating on it. And you know, our INDC or NDC is defined in terms of a economy-wide GHG target. So that serves also as a tracking tool, but we actually assess the closeness to which we are to our target, and make an outlook of, if we were to continue doing this, this is the extent to which we will miss or meet the target. This is how much we have coupled and decoupled our economic growth with GHG emissions. I won't talk about the others there, sectoral and others. In provinces and cities, for us, they're important to take them out, because it is always important to have a focused discussions of how cities and provinces are responding on their own. Then you know that our INDC or NDC now also has defined a few mitigation programs and projects. Our renewable energy independent power production project or program, our carbon tax issues, that's where we now start to assess them. And there it is in terms of progress and implementation, how far are we with implementing it, what is the mitigation impact that has been achieved and that is envisaged, other sustainable development core benefits and costs. And I think the issue of core costs is also important to actually transparently say, well, while we have gained so many jobs in the green economy, it must also be noted that we have lost so many jobs in the non-clean economies, which is the coal economy and others. This is for transparency purposes. Tracking climate finance, as I said, bilateral and multilateral, and so on. I won't go through the others because of time, I suppose, but you'll see that then we try to cover a number of things around the system itself, around international governance of climate change, to keep abreast on the outcomes of each and every COP. What are the implications for South Africa, and then we report on that. Phased implementation, The implementation itself is split into 3 phases. One is one that is until the end of this year. It might extend a little bit. This is really the setting up of all the things that we need to do. Most of them are done, and then it will take 2 to 3 years where we are putting them into testing, and then we are reviewing them. And phase 3, which is 2019 to 2020 to 2021 probably, we are then refining it to ensure that that they should now be working properly. The last slide from my side is really that of challenges and lessons. This, I think, was requested also, but I will take them one by one. One, well, we learned that the need to develop high-level framework is absolutely critical. So, and by high-level framework, we mean to define the M&E system, or this MRV system that we're talking about. What does it do? What should it do? What does it cover? What does it not cover? We started with that work first. And point number 2 there points to the fact that our monitoring and evaluation system is not primarily a transparency tool for the UNFCCC. Transparency elements under the UNFCCC are secondary. The primary objective of the system, and I think this is a lesson that I want to share with you to consider if you're in the process of developing this, to start primarily to think about why you would need to track climate change information for your own self, how, for developing proper policies, for learning on how others did it or how other sectors did it, for improving certain things, but also accommodating the UNFCCC reports and obligations. What I've found generally, and I've done a study, I've assessed about 9 or 10 countries on this. I've realized that the domestic information requirements on climate change are almost always broader or more than the UNFCCC transparency requirements. And therefore, when you develop a system that is primarily focused domestically, most of the time it is more than adequate. That system is more than adequate to actually respond to the UNFCCC requirements. Number 3, the need for guidelines. The guidelines that will focus on the scope of monitoring and evaluation. As I said, from a mitigation and adaptation perspective, both elements, we had to define what we mean by a goal so that we can develop indicators to track our progress towards the goal. Number 4, for all the components of the system for ourselves, we had to clearly define the objectives. I think I've said that already. And number 5 talks to broad participation. This is stakeholder engagement, detailed stakeholder engagement, to actually ask the municipalities, to ask the provincial governments, to ask research institutions to say, what kind of information, in addition to this, would you want generated to help you do your work better, or to inform you in better doing this? So that at the end of the day, the system that is designed is not your system as one government ministry, but it is a national system where everyone can actually associate, which everyone can associate with. As far as possible, build on and align existing systems. So what we did, the system itself, we looked at other information systems and programs that are already there, and they became feeder systems into our M&A system as a whole. A legal framework, for us, we do not have a legal framework at the moment, so it is still one of the challenges that our information collection process is still based largely on relationships, but in some cases on memoranda of understanding or agreements. But ideally, I think some sort of legal framework to ensure timely information sharing is key. My very last point and statement is that what we want to do, and this was beneficial, was then sold the M&E system not as a compliance mechanism that is burdensome for people, but to say it is a tool which, if everyone was to participate in, this is how it could help you or how it could be beneficial to you, rather than this is how you'll be punished if you don't do it well. This is my last slide, colleagues. Thank you very much.
Excellent. Tapelo, thank you so much for the extremely comprehensive presentation and for taking the time. I know that you have to run. I think that we have a couple questions from the audience, so I'm wondering if maybe I can just ask you to stay for 3-4 minutes. I'd like to hand it over to my colleague Sven, who is from the International Partnership on Mitigation and MRV, who is collating the questions and can go ahead and pose something to you before we hand it over to Dan.
No problem.
Thank you. Thank you, Alison, and thank you, Tapelo, for that interesting presentation. Actually, right now we have one question for you, Tapelo, from the audience, and I will just read it out for you. So the question goes, how did you get the buy-in from the other reporting organizations, and what did you do to convince them to cooperate and share the data?
Thank you very much. I think I've talked to this a little bit already, that these are two things. One, what we did as we developed the system as a whole, we had a broad stakeholder involvement. And this means all the departments, all the researchers, and even business, organized business was represented to design, to ask our questions. Well, this is where we need to go. This is what we need the system to do. How best do we do it? So at the end of the day, we defined what the needs were of the system. So even industry said, well, it would be nice for us if we could continually know 1, 2, 3, 4. We said, fantastic, we'll put it into the system. And then others said, no, if this type of information could also be collected and available over time, this would be useful. Therefore, at the end, it became a system wherein everyone's needs we try to accommodate as far as possible. And at the end of the day, it was not DIA's monitoring system. It was a national monitoring system. So industry could not come to us and say, why are you requiring this information? We would say, well, you and I agreed that this is information that is required. So that is the one part of this. And in fact, I think I've also talked to the other part of saying, then selling it to then say, but how can, what type of M&E system would make your life better in terms of climate information or the work you are doing daily basis? What information would you like to know so that everyone becomes, feels they are a beneficiary, one, and two, feels they are part of the system. Thanks.
Great. Thank you very much, Tapelo. I definitely hear what you're saying, making sure that it's beneficial as opposed to a compliance, and making others feel as if they're part of the process as opposed to being needed to report to a larger entity. Sven, do we have any other questions for Tapelo before he has to excuse himself?
No, there's actually quite a few other questions, but more general in nature. So I would suggest that we have it later. And as far as I can see, for now, no more specific questions for Tapelo at this point.
Great, thank you so much. So with that, I would like to thank Tapelo and go ahead, and I know that you have another teleconference to go to.
Hello?
So we want to thank you for your time, and we will be in touch with you afterwards. But with that, I would like to go ahead and introduce our last speaker, who will be giving the country presentation or the experience from Ghana. The speaker's name is Daniel Tutu Benefor, and Daniel leads the Mitigation, Analysis, and Reporting subprogram in the Environmental Protection Agency in Ghana. He has technical responsibilities over mitigation and transparency of climate actions. He leads the following. He leads the Low Emission Capacity Building Project, the National Greenhouse Gas Inventory, and the preparation of the National Communication and the Biennial Update Report, or what we keep referring to as BERS. He has over 10 years of experience in climate change issues in Ghana and at the national level. So with that, I would like to hand the screen over to Daniel so that he can give us the perspective from Ghana before we open for a general question and answer session, which will include Dan and Kelly. I'm handing the screen to you, Dan. If you just want to grab it and go ahead with your presentation, you are more than welcome.
you see my screen now?
Yes, we can see your screen and I can hear you clear.
And thank you very much for the opportunity, and good afternoon from Ghana. And we are to share with you our experiences in the implementation of the transparency work, or the MRV work in Ghana. I would briefly talk about the steps that we are taking towards implementation of Ghana's NDCs and the role of the Ghana Climate Ambitious Reporting Program and the lessons so far. So that is how I've structured the conversation this afternoon. As you can see, Ghana is already defined its intention to engage in an early implementation of its INDC or its NDCs, and with the intention of ensuring the implementation of a 10-year agenda towards a sustainable future that is responsive to climate change. So we've already had very advanced discussions as to how to start implementation right away, apparently. And we've already looked at how to start the national process of already joining the agreement. So we expect that by the end of September or so, we will join the agreement by ratification. We are also already engaged in the early prioritization of our 31 INDC actions. We are also given the go-ahead to start to mobilize investment into the prioritized action. And we are also very much thinking about demonstrating early results of our early actions. So this is how we've structured the next actions or the next steps towards implementation of our INDCs. So as you can see, there are 5 major important building blocks that's really driving the implementation of our INDC. As you can see, we are looking at the first work package, which is looking at prioritizing the 31 NDCs into our first NDC, which is the first 5 years, which would also mean that we should begin to look at sectoral allocation of responsibilities of the INDC actions. We are also very much aware, or very much trying to link the importance of the pre-2020 actions towards the first NDC action. So that's the first work package on how to prioritize the actions, and also linking the actions to the pre-2020 actions that are already ongoing. What is also very important to highlight at this stage is also the fact that we are seeking to adopt a similar approach of how to allocate responsibilities towards different sectors. The next work package is on the role of institution and engagements. Again, that will be addressed in the implementation phase of Ghana's NDCs, and that is mainly looking at issues on governance and institutions and awareness creation. That we believe is a very important pillar or building block of getting the different ministries to come on board. So it's very important to highlight the need for the role of institutions and how to engage them. The last 3 pillars relates to efforts to track the goals of attaining our NDC goals, and also monitoring of impact of actions, as well as the need to mobilize support and partnership. And that is where the Ghana's ambitious climate reporting comes to play. It really fits squarely in tracking the progress towards attaining our long-term targets, and also trying to really assess the impact of actions as they occur, and also how it relates to actions and support and partnership. So that is the very important piece that connects the NDC's implementation and also the GCAP. So what is the GCAP? The GCAP is basically a national plan to put in place an integrated national system that will do about 4 main things. The first one is the system should be to help us continuously monitor and measure GHG emissions. So this, we have a very good experience in trying to use the system to really collect data and report and process GHG emissions. Now there are three new things that we are trying to introduce into the GCAP, which is a new way of linking the impact of mitigation actions and also support and also tracking attainment of the NDC target. So those are three very new items that we've added, and the whole idea is to have an integrated system that is working. It's not only about monitoring and measurements, but it's also about compilation and preparation, and also, very importantly, as my colleague from South Africa mentioned, the need to have a domestic niche of the products that you generate from using the GCAP. So we are trying to also get the local audience, get to see the value of the use of the GCAP and how it will be useful for domestic decision making, and also at the same time meets the international reporting requirements. The third part, or the fourth part, excuse me, is the system must be able to help us have a certain level of verification or review. So that is really the broad thematic structure of the GCAP. And I must say that, as I said, that the emission part of the GCAP had been in the system for some time and therefore had gathered a lot of experience. The element of the national system, as you can see, basically four main important things. The first one is the system really have a part that deals with institutions and their roles. And as I mentioned earlier, we had implemented a greenhouse gas emissions program for some time, and therefore there has been some continuous improvement of how institutions have their roles to play in the system. And that had really led to the decision to decentralize the functions of the emission inventories to different ministries. And we intend to expand the mandate of the ministries to include the additional 3 tasks, which is the mitigation of actions and also finance tracking and also the tracking of the NDC goals. So that is a very important piece of the system. And then these agencies work together through an MOU already. As I said, we already have 7 different multi-sectoral teams that is working in different sectors. There's also a very important part or piece of the national system, which is the legal basis and the Environmental Protection Agency Act 490 is the very core legal backbone of the GCAP, and it has a very important coverage for both industry and also local authorities. The National Development Planning Commission Act is also the act that is also relevant for policy M&E system, and the plan is to really integrate the M&E system with the MRV system for the country. So that's why I made reference to the NDC Act 656. Another piece of the national system is how to collect data, what methodologies are available, and also a very important piece of it is also the IT infrastructure of the national system. So as you can see, we've already developed an online data hub that really is supposed to help improve archiving and disclosure and public access of data. We've also adopted the use of the IPCC guideline 2006. We have also developed a national domestic GHG inventory plan that is supposed to really further develop the IPCC guidelines into simple, non-technical language for our team members. We've also developed a very interesting data templates for the collection of data on a continuous basis across the board. We've also developed a national QAQC plan, which is also a further work beyond IPCC guidelines. So that quadrant really contains issues on data management and also the use of IT to help archive and ensure access to data. The last part of it is also the development of skill sets and the overall scope of the national system. The national system, as I said earlier, covers both the national scope, corporate entities as well, and also the project level. We are currently working with the major utility company in Ghana that is developing its own corporate accounting system. and that is fed squarely into this structure. The other part of it is also the idea of having continuous training for our team members, and that for me is a very important piece of the pie, because then it exposes them to new ways of doing things, and also learning new things from different stakeholders, and also getting to know what are the new requirements of the work that we do to ensure improvements. We've also been able to train our people using the university program, for which ultimately they get access to the university list of experts, and that is also a very important way of training our people by learning to learn what is being done in different countries. So, what are the rollout plan? As you can see, we have 4 very important pillars. The first one is access to data, what to monitor and how to monitor, or what to measure. So the quadrant on data gives you a sense of monitoring and measurement of data that goes into the system. So we have annual surveys, facility reports. We've also established a data sharing network, and currently we are planning to integrate the national progress report indicators to be integrated into the monitoring structure of the GCAP. So that is on the part of data. So what to monitor is very important. The next aspect of the quadrant is also institutions, which also defines their role and functions. And that really is very important, because then you carefully sections roles and functions for different institutions at what level, and then that helps you to get your data, which is also very important. Then when it comes to the system, the point is that how do you manage the data? So the quadrant on data really looks at infrastructure for data management, and also the operation and maintenance rules of the data management system. That is also a very important piece of the GCAP structure. The last part of it is also the IT infrastructure, which helps us to then report and disclose the results of the work of the GCAP. So that's how the system works. So we have already set out a plan to roll it out. We are currently at the stage of integration, and the system has been set up. The implementation is moving on gradually. We are at the stage of integrating the existing MRV system by including the 3 new tax, and also seeking to integrate it with the national M&E system. So that is the part on integration. And we plan to have it completely deployed by 2020. So that is how the structure looked like from the planning stage to the stage of integration and piloting and deployment and first upgrade. So that's the structure of how we plan to get it thoroughly implemented. So the point here is that implementation would be based on phased-out approach and gradual approach before 2020. When it comes to climate financing, the first part of the GCAP, we have set out a very broad tracking infrastructure, which is seeking to bring different climate financing sources into a central system that can help us deal with both official ODA and non-ODA inflows, and also money is going to projects into one tracking system that can help us to coordinate the inflows of climate finance and be able to publish them on a regular basis. So that's the structure of the climate tracking system in the country, and as I said, it tries to look at all possible sources of financing flows in the country and how we can bring them under one structure. So achievements so far, as I said earlier, we have had enough experience in the implementation of the GAG MRV emission part of the GCAP, and we've been doing it for the past 20 years, and we've carefully been improving it since 2000. And as I mentioned earlier, we have already established a climate data hub, which is supposed to facilitate access to data, general public, and also ensure disclosure and archiving of data in the system. The third important achievement for us is also the fact that we've been able to decentralize the tax of the MRVs to line ministries. And to us, this is a very important achievement, because then it stimulates ownership of the process and also relevance in planning in that particular ministry. We have also been able to carefully put together 30 experts from 16 public and private institutions constituting what I refer to as the multi-sectoral team that is really behind this. So human resources is also very important for us, and how to manage them is also very crucial. With this system, we've been able to produce 3 national communication, 2 independent national inventory reports, and one bear already last year. We've also been successfully completed our ICO process, and that was a very interesting process, and we've learned a lot from it. Currently, we are planning the next reporting structure, and that would include a compilation of all the reviews that we got from the previous process, and the plan is to incorporate, where possible, the review comments that we have had from both the ICA process and also the informal technical reviews that we had in the country. We are also currently focusing on developing an MRV scheme for the electricity subsector. The reason is that it is a major emission source in the country, and we thought it's important to really improve the MRV system for power generation in the country. What you see is a screenshot of the climate data hub. It has a very 3 important portals: the GAG portal, and then what we refer to as a domestic electronic register system called the DES, and also the policies and measures. So each of them can lead greater detail of information when you want to access. And the whole concept is to link GAG MRV for GAG, MRV for action, linked by support. So that's the whole concept behind this online data hub. What you see here are the screenshots of the 3 reports that we produce with the GCAP system in place, and this is one of the most important products from the GCAP structure. There are a couple of barriers that we are still trying to address. The first one is that, as I said, these are all plans, and getting them fully implemented can be very, very slow and a very tough endeavor. And as you can see, it involves different ministries, it involves several stakeholders, and the progress of the implementation can be very, very slow, and you need to be very consistent. Another point that I want to raise is also the fact that because the funds that are available to support this work is mainly donor-driven, and you virtually have no national or low national budgetary allocation, it tends to stifle the work, because then you tend not to have enough funds to support the work. The other part of it is also the attempt to really make the results of the GCAP work visible and relevant for policy making. That is also a very important barrier that we need to really try to address. The third part is also the access to the good quality data. In many cases, you don't have data, they don't exist, even though that exists are of low quality. And therefore, it's important that we also continue to invest in improving access to data and also improving the quality as well. And here research comes in very, very handy. We also feel that we also need to continuously help build capacity, especially for the line ministries, because then it's new faces come in, and it's important that we continuously build capacity and raise the visibility of the work that comes with the GCAP. The last part of it is also how to raise general awareness, and that is also very important for us. The last but important thing that my colleague from South Africa shared is also how to develop a very effective indicators to assess implementation of adaptation actions and their effects. That is a challenge for us, and we'll be very glad to learn from how others are approaching it. Some success factors. We believe that we've been successful to this extent because we've adopted the approach to integrate and build on what is really working and seeking to include it in the existing development M&A system. So the whole idea is not to really reinvent a new system, but to build on what is really existing and build into it. The other approach is also to use a phased-out approach where we progressively improve upon the system. And that, for us, is a very important success factor. The other one is also the idea of decentralizing the MRV tax to line ministries. And we believe that that's a very important way to ensure long-term sustainability of that work and also to spare up the ownership of the process. We also believe that many of our team members also see the idea of acquiring new skills by being part of it to really motivate career development. And I think that is also a very important success factor because they see this work as a new way of acquiring skills. Another part of it is also the fact that we have a continuous training program for our team members. And the fact that you get a chance to also experience or get exposure to see what is being done in different countries. Another very important part is also having a dedicated team from the ministries to work with us on a continuous basis. And we believe that having a team that is consistent, that is motivated, that is committed to this process can really make it much more successful. Thank you very much, and this is my last slide.
Great. Wow. Thank you very, very much, Dan. It was an extremely comprehensive presentation, extremely interesting. I imagine that it will prompt a number of questions. It's also something that I look forward to sharing with others because I think it lays out the framework excellent and gives a lot of good information on how to build on things. So we are a little bit low on time, I recognize. I think this always happens, but I would like to go ahead and open the floor to the attendees so that you can pose questions. I will just remind you that there are two different ways that you can ask questions. You can go ahead and raise your hand, in which case Sven and I will open it up, and you can use your voice to speak directly to the presenters, or you're welcome to type your question in the question box on the control panel, and then Sven will go ahead and read that question out. I just want to, while we're collecting some questions, Dan, I wanted to pose a question to you because I know that this question constantly comes up, and it's that of the funding. So you mentioned, I mean, this is extremely comprehensive, multi-year, ongoing system, and of course it takes a great deal of funding not only to build the IT system but also to do the you know, awareness building, to continuously update the system and so forth. And you mentioned that it's hard because it's kind of dependent on donor-driven funds. I'm curious, with the Paris Agreement and that framework, if the government has kind of changed path a little bit, and if there is the possibility of more national funding that will go into it just because of the importance in the transparency framework and the reporting system now. Do you see a shift with that at all, or is it still will remain one of the main barriers?
Thank you, Alison, and thanks for the feedback. In terms of funding, we've as we speak now, we've not seen any shifts beyond what is already the case, and there's no indication yet towards mobilizing domestic support for this work. Okay.
Okay, that's interesting. Thank you. I would like to, Sven, are there any questions that are ready to pose to either Dan or to Kelly, who is still on the line and available to answer any questions? Sven, you're still there? Looks like you're on mute.
Yes, I'm here, Alison. There's actually quite a few questions for Kelly and also Daniel, but I can see that there's one hand raised by Mr. Ali Mevanse Meveo, and I will now unmute you, and you will have the chance to directly speak to Daniel, Kelly, or whoever you want to pose the question. So you are unmuted now. The floor is yours.
Okay. Thank you very much. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Good evening. My name is Ali Manzei. I'm a deputy coordinator for a program called SLEEK. SLEEK stands for System for Land-Based Emission Estimation in Kenya. We are trying to build a Tier 3 reporting system for land-based emission estimation in Kenya under the Ministry of Environment and Natural Resources. I have two questions for Mr. Daniel Tutu. One question would be, Mr. Daniel Tutu talked of having submitted or done 3 national communications to the UNFCCC. My question would be, I would want to know under which tier have they been reporting the emissions from the land sector? Number 2, he talked of data sharing networks. I would like to understand how the different stakeholders who are data producers are able to be obliged to give data for purposes of use in the communications. Those are my 2 questions. Thank you very much.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Ali.
Yeah.
Dan, did you go ahead and get those questions? Will you be able to answer those?
Yes. Thank you, and thank you very much for the question, colleague from Kenya. Just to be straight here, the first 2 national communication that we did, we fairly adopted a Tier 1 approach for the land-based emissions, but it is in but for the third one that we did, we had some support to develop country-specific data, so we could move from the Tier 1 to Tier 2 or higher tier already. So we've done a higher tier accounting for the land-based emissions or land sector emissions.
Sector.
They improve. Yes. So the land sector we've moved to a Tier 2 because we had support to really do detailed data collection on deforestation and also developed emission factor data for various eco zones in the country.
Exactly.
In terms of the data sharing network, is a bit different for different stakeholders. So, for example, the Environmental Impact Assessment Law, the LI 1652, requires industry to regularly, every 6 months, submit reports to the EPA. So that is by law. That's by law.
Exactly.
But for the non-industries, for like researchers and for NGOs and other MDAs, they supply the data to us on goodwill and also on the basis of the agreement of the MOU that we strike with them.
Exactly.
So even for some researchers, it is, unless they publish their results in a peer journal or in a report, it is difficult to even have access to research data, because then they have to justifiably make use of their results first before you can get access to it. So I must say that access to data is really particular or peculiar for different stakeholders. But for the industry, it is fairly simple and straightforward because of the law.
Exactly. That's clear. Daniel.
Great. Thank you very much, Daniel. We have a number of other questions that are coming from the audience that I believe Sven is collecting. Sven, did you want to maybe collect or pose a couple of those to Kelly or Dan?
Yes. Yeah, there's actually one more question from the audience, and this is also directed to Daniel. And the question is in regards to who allocates those tasks, those air tasks for MRV for collecting data to the individual ministries. Is it through a common consensus during a stakeholder consultation, or is it some national authority that directs them to perform their tasks? And there's another question for Kelly, and this was in regards to the acronym BUR and what does it stand for. So I suggest maybe Kelly, you go ahead and answer the first question, and then we have Daniel answer the other question.
Sure, thanks so much, Sven, and I'm so sorry that I did not actually define that. BUR is a biennial update report, and these are reports to be submitted by developing countries. The corollary with developed countries is biennial reports, and they contain updates on national greenhouse gas inventories, as well as information on mitigation actions and needs and support received. So the reports provide updates on actions that are undertaken by a given party to implement the convention and their nationally appropriate mitigation actions, and provide an update on greenhouse gas emissions and removals through the inventory and any implementation and effects of actions that have been undertaken. So this is biennial, so it's submitted every 2 years, and my apologies again, I should have certainly defined that.
Thanks a lot, Kelly, for that answer. And then I'd like to have that other question for you, Daniel, just to quickly remind you, it was in regards to who's allocating those responsibilities for the different ministries. Is it through a stakeholder consultation, or is it a national authority that directs to perform that directs those tasks, basically?
It was basically through stakeholder consultation and agreement, but the decision to allocate a tax through that process was also based on the legal mandate of that particular institution. So, for example, the Forestry Commission is responsible for the land-based emissions because they are by law responsible for the management of the forestry estate of the country. So that is how the stakeholder consultation allocated that function to the Forestry Commission based on their mandate.
Thanks, Daniel. And there's one more question in regards to the climate change data hub that you mentioned through your presentation. And the question is, who verifies the quality and the accuracy of the data that is coming into that hub?
Okay, thank you very much. Again, as we speak now, we have appointed what is called a non-technical webmaster and a technical webmaster. The two of them, one is focusing on the IT filtering process, and the technical one is looking at the technical quality of the information. So before any data is published on the website, it ought to go through the non-technical webmaster who will deal with the IT parts of the quality checks, and the technical webmaster would also look at how the information contained or that what's coming through meets our own standards. So our standards is the source, the quality, whether it meets our own standards. So I'm saying that before it is published, it goes through some background filtering. The filtering is both for IT and non-IT.
Yeah, thanks, Daniel, for the answer. I think we are a bit over schedule, but I would like to raise one last question to you, Kelly, And the question is whether WRI has any experience in incorporating facility or corporate level GHG reporting, international level reporting, and whether there's a protocol or procedure available.
Yeah, so it's a great question. We have put together a paper that looked at the interactions between corporate and facility inventories as well as national inventories, and looked at the extent to which there are synergies between them, the extent to which they can be designed in a way that can be the most helpful for national inventories, and also obviously some of the key differences and how they support different objectives. And I wonder if I have time, if I can just quickly put the URL in the box here to be able to share that paper link with everybody, and then it could be sent around. But there are certainly, I've got it. There are certainly some ways in which these can be designed in a way that can be quite helpful for helping to integrate into a national inventory system, but certainly, obviously, some limitations as well. And I think, let me know if I have been successful. I think maybe, Allison, I'm only able to send it to you or to Sven, and maybe you could pass it along to the others.
Yes, I think we will be able to. Yes, thanks, Kelly. We will be able to pass it along, and also we will write a follow-up email where we can include the link. Yeah, maybe let's have one last question for Daniel, and it is the question is what are the most important requirements that you considered in developing the system, and how is the system upgraded over time?
Thank you very much. I'm sure you are referring to the online system, or you are referring to the entire GCAP system.
I think it's in regards to the entire system. I would think.
Just to be clear, it's a very important, four very important elements that I consider very useful. Is one, the importance of getting the buy-in of the line ministries. For me, is a very important piece of the pie, because these are the ministries or the stakeholders that sometimes own the data. They are the ones who are also developing investments that would impact on their missions, and therefore their involvement is very, very key. So the first part of the pie is about the institutions, and you have clear roles. The other part of the pie, which is also very important for me, is the fact that you have a very clear way of planning. It took us some time to be able to develop a 2-year national plan for the inventory process. So for me, having a good, simple to implement, realistic 2-year plan for your inventory process is very important. The third one is about eventually having a system for archiving and retrieval. Again, it took us nearly 8 years to be able to realize the importance of archiving and making commitment and investment in IT infrastructure. And for me, that is also a very important part. The last part of it is a very important piece, is also making the result or the process visible to high-level decision makers. I think it is one piece that we've not been able to achieve very well, because it is only through that process that the policymakers will see the value or the need to make use of the results from this process. So that is what I can share.
Great. I think those were excellent points to end on, actually. I know that we've gone over quite a bit, so I thank you all for your patience and for staying with us. I think that it was extremely helpful. I would like to remind everyone that if you found these two cases helpful, that of Ghana and South Africa, you can, we encourage you to visit the Global Good Practice Analysis database, which gives you the opportunity to look at any of the 40 case studies that we've collected there, and also to search among the different case studies based on region, country, sector, activity, barrier, or the good practice criteria. We also have included a link to other good practice initiatives, and the idea here is that we have an immense amount of learning to gather from our peers around the world, and we, through UNDP Low Emission Capacity Building Program and the International Partnership on Mitigation and MRV, are trying to collect those good practices and create a hub for peer-to-peer learning and exchange. I will go ahead and after this the session ends, I will share the link to the recordings, the link to all of the presentations, as well as the link that Kelly shared in the chat box, and the final link to the Global Good Practice Analysis. And we will also be sure to reach out to each of you to share when our next webinar is taking place. That will be at the end of July, and we hope that you will join us in that too. With this, I would like to thank both Kelly and Dan and Sven. It was excellent having the presentations from everyone. Sven, it was excellent having you there to be able to pose the questions and engage with the speakers. Yeah, with that, I would just like to thank you both, and Sven and I are very much appreciative of the time that you've taken, and we wish you all a good afternoon, evening, whatever the case may be where you are. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye. Thanks so much. Bye.